I'm Johnny Buchanan. Now then, are you ready to kind of just melt into a slightly 70s kind of a place? Hope so. Here's a track. Okay, nice warm place to begin. Okay, so what we're going to do within this episode is to explore a range of doubling techniques. This idea that effectively what we can do is to process sounds with copies of those sounds overlaid on top of the originals. Now, forever, producers have looked for ways to expand the kind of sounds that they put into their tracks, ways of making them kind of supernaturally bigger than they were before. And at the sort of foundation of the techniques that I'm talking about, we're going to start with the idea of chorus. Now, chorus, as its name suggests, sort of takes its idea, or its name from the idea that if the original sound represents one voice, what might that sound like if that same part was recorded by many voices? Think about the idea of a solo singer and then maybe a group of 3 or 4 people all singing the same part. There'd be variation in the tone of their voices, slight variations in the pitch, even if they're all singing the same note. Effectively, what would end up is a kind of widening, a sort of grandening, if you like, of the kind of feel of those individual parts. And what we're going to do is to understand chorus a little bit better, and then we're going to sort of extrapolate outwards to some other chorus-based or doubling techniques that can take a piece of music like this into slightly different places. Now, to look at chorus, what we're going to do is to have a listen to this part, which I think is appropriately called bendy synth. It sounds like this. It's a synth and it's bendy. Okay, what I'm going to do on this track is I'm going to set up from the, where am I going? To the modulation section. I'm going to come and find chorus right up here at the top of the list. Now, effectively, what chorus gives us is an incredibly simple little control set, which firstly requires us to understand effectively what is happening when we apply chorus. So really what's happening is that we get a copy of the original signal, which is mixed back in with the original, but with an LFO applied to that copy, which effectively then modulates the kind of pitch of that original sound. So if you imagine the original sound happening, a small delay happening, a copy of the sound then playing back on top of it, and the possibility for that copy to have its pitch modulated in some way, we then understand chorus. So effectively what I'm looking at here is firstly the speed of the LFO, which is happening here at the rate dial, the intensity, which literally means how significantly is that LFO going to impact into the way that the sound is, or the chorus is being generated. And then what I've got a chance to do is to decide how much to mix the copied version in with the original. That makes sense? Okay, so what we'll do is we'll start gently. I'm going to turn the rate down so we're getting a slow chorus effect. I'm going to keep the intensity relatively low too. And as we listen through this, I'm going to adjust all 3 of those parameters. So as with any LFO, within any synthesizer, the moment we push the LFO amount up too much, we start getting into kind of science fiction territory. But you can begin to see or hear very clearly now what all three of these dials do. Effectively, what they're doing is they're changing the speed of that modulated signal, the intensity of that, and then how much I want to blend that in. Now let's just come back to the beginning of this track again and press play. This time what I'm going to do is to bypass the chorus effect, and I'll punch it in after a couple of bars. So even though this part is quite quiet in the mix of this piece, particularly on that last chord, you can really hear the kind of width and extra-ness that we get. Extra-ness is becoming my new favourite word on this channel, that we get from this kind of chorus effect. It's literally like having our synth sung by more than one synth playing that part. It's a nice place to start. Okay, now then, let's just compare that to another chorus type effect, which I'm actually going to add to the same track. I'm going to just bypass my original chorus for a second, but staying with our bendy synth for a moment, what I'm going to do is to come to an effect called Ensemble, which is in exactly the same place. It's in the modulation section, and then look, because these are alphabetized, it's the next one down. How convenient. Now, effectively, what we've got here is an extension of the same idea. Let's just make this interface a little bit bigger for a moment. Now then, a moment ago, within the chorus effect, what we had was one LFO, and we had an opportunity to choose the speed of that, the intensity of it, all that kind of stuff. Well, we've got the same thing here. Let's imagine for a second, LFO 1 was the only LFO we had available. I'm going to just turn off the others up here for a moment so we can see what we're dealing with. Again, I've got a rate control, and again, I've got an intensity control, and again, I've got an output mix control, effectively giving me exactly what I had within the chorus. However, I've got a couple of other things here too. Firstly, I can use Ensemble to increase the stereo spread amount. In other words, what I can do is to start literally applying the processing that I'm offering up through Ensemble across a kind of stereo spread. Let's make this sound wider than the original. What I've also got is the opportunity to decide how many voices I want to hear. And you can see very neatly that this kind of graphic changes. In other words, remember I was talking a little while ago about the idea that this part is going to be sung by a number of voices. Effectively, each one of these is the next stage, the next delay of the LFO. Imagine all of these are slightly out of phase with one another. And as a result of that, what we get with each new voice is another delayed version of the same thing, a much bigger kind of sounding chorus. Well, what does that sound like? Here's the original. And back in. Okay, so it sounds like an even bigger chorus. Except that what I've also got is a second LFO here, which gives me a whole other collection of that kind of doubled approach. It's going to use the same number of voices. These are effectively global controls down here at the bottom. But what I've got is a separate rate control and a separate intensity control. So this is effectively a second lot of all of that LFO movement. And now we're getting to some really interesting pitch territory. It's like a sort of old bit of tape now, whilst we don't have the kind of hiss that might come from tape. Nevertheless, there's kind of something amazingly reassuring about the kind of warmth of this sound. And then what we've also got is a whole other LFO, but this one has got a more random shape. So what I'm in a position to do is to introduce a sort of randomization third LFO shape. And you can see that rather than having a kind of sine wave shape, what we've got instead is this kind of unpredictable movement, which is coming from this extra thing. Again, what I've got is a rate control for it. We know that when I get into really quick rates, things get silly, but nevertheless, sometimes silly is really good, let's be honest. But nevertheless, let's just keep this to a little bit of a minimum. Now, as I say, I've got a number of voices here that I can control, so I can decide how big I want this effect to be. Let's just start with one extra voice, and what I'll do is to dial that round to the right-hand side as we listen back. So that's making things really nice and, yeah, quite chilled, quite mellow. Are you still awake? I ask that question a lot on this channel too. I've got to be careful with that. Okay, so we've looked at chorus and we've looked at ensemble, and effectively both of those are applied to this one sound. At the moment, obviously the chorus is bypassed, but we understand that. Let's just listen to the whole track again for a moment, just to wake you up. Okay, so what I'm going to do next is to come to the guitar part, which is on the track underneath. I've just slightly lessened the effect of that. So I'm going to come back to the guitar. Let's just solo this for a moment. Now, what I'm going to do next is to fire up the phaser. So this fire up the phaser. Again, I told you it was 70s. It's sort of becoming, I don't know, some sort of terrible costume drama, this episode straight away. Okay, so now what we've got is a phaser. Now, this is based on the same idea, that effectively what we're going to get is a delayed second version of the sound. But effectively, what we get with a phaser is the idea that literally the phase, the shape of the waveform that's being drawn, is going to be inverted. It's going to be out of phase with the original. And what we've also got is this idea that alongside that, there is a filtering process that is applied to that copy. And what we get, well, the moment I press play, if you've never heard a phaser before, imagine if that were true, you're going to begin to hear this kind of lovely, undulating kind of warmth, which is the kind of copy of the sound out of phase with the original being filtered. Doesn't it sound delicious? Okay, so I get to choose a whole bunch of things here. So firstly, what I can do is to choose the speed of the LFO movement. In fact, in Logic's phaser, there isn't just one LFO, there are two, and we've already seen that idea, this idea of having separate LFOs working on the sound in different ways. So effectively, I can just choose a rate for those in hertz, cycles per second, or if I want to, I can clock them to the tempo of my project. So if I want the phaser to kind of stay neatly within this kind of interesting idea of like undulating at different speeds, I can do that. I can choose kind of quantized values for these if I want to. So that's one thing I can do. But what I can also do is to choose how in or out of phase these are. So at the moment, 180-degree phase literally means the opposite of the original. But if I want to, I can change the phase amount too. I can choose the amount of feedback. So in other words, how kind of phasey the phaser is. There's a bit of teaching for you. So effectively, in other words, how much we kind of hear the undulations in that and how kind of pointy that sound becomes. A whole bunch of things that I've got control over here as well. And also we've got the opportunity to control the filter sweep. So in other words, the filter that's applying its processing to those LFOs, if I want to, I can restrict the frequency range over which they work too. So let's just play with a few of those parameters as we listen back. There's that pointiness. Now, effectively, what I have a chance to do with this mix control is to bias the sound between these two LFOs. So at the moment, we're hearing 90% of the effect of the first LFO and only 10% of the second, but this crossfader allows me to effectively bias the sound between two lots of movements. But effectively, what we've got here is, hopefully, an understanding now of the way that phasers work. So effectively what we've got so far is this copy, which is out of phase with the original, which effectively is just almost like a kind of echo of the original, which is then being processed. And it's that part that's different if we swap a phaser for a flanger. Let's do that next. I'm going to keep the phaser in channel, and again on this guitar part, I'm going to come back once again to the modulation section, and the difference with the flanger is that what this does is to feed the copied signal back to the input stage of the original sound. So effectively what happens is we almost get a little feedback loop for all of the ways in which an original chorus unit behaves. Okay, sorry, I've rushed ahead with that. Let's just deal with that again. Let's go back to chorus. This idea that effectively we've got a number of voices, one or multiple, that effectively is a delayed version of the original signal, and we have an LFO which is modulating that signal to produce a wider pitch bass. With a flanger, what we have a chance to do is to feed those copies back in almost as a feedback loop. And as a result, what we get is this amazingly watery sound. So if you think about it, a lot of these controls, let me get rid of the phaser behind it because that's confusing things. So to deal with the flanger, we've got a bunch of controls here that we saw with the chorus unit. We've got the speed of our LFO, we've got the intensity of our LFO, and we've got a mix control, but we've also got this feedback amount. How much are we sending the signal back in on itself? And again, we get into sci-fi territory and I make that too high. But if we get this right from an intensity perspective and we kind of get our feedback control right, and maybe we clock this to tempo, what we end up with is this kind of super chilled out, very beautiful, watery guitar sound. Nice. Okay, now there are a couple of other things I want to do just before we listen to our chorus effects in action. Can I only apply chorusing or flanging or phasing or these doubling effects to individual sounds at the insert stage so that they're kind of being processed and that's the thing that they become? Or is there a way that I can play with these techniques too? Well, I'm going to just solo these two sounds here, this pluck part, twang pluck. You have to be careful how you say that. And what I'm going to do is I'm also going to solo this warm keys part, which is down here at the bottom. And within the mixer, what I'm going to do for these two sounds is I'm going to set up an auxiliary bus. And I'm going to turn that up, and to that auxiliary bus, I'm going to apply a little bit of chroma verb. And of all of the algorithms, I think the one that feels most appropriate, I'm slightly stalling as I choose one, might be, okay, well, let's go with this kind of synth hall. This idea that we're going to create some sort of a synthy place. Okay, let's go with that. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger from a decay perspective so that we've got a nice long reverb, and what that sounds like is this. And I'm just wondering what might happen if we move the phaser across from the guitar part and we put it after the reverb. Now remember, because this is an auxiliary bus, this is just reverb. You can see the wet amount is 100% wet, so it's only providing reverb. What happens if we phase that reverb? I rather like that. So effectively what we've got is this idea that now the reverb is becoming phased. So on those two sounds, what we've got as a kind of legacy of them is a kind of doubling effect, which is being applied to reverb rather than to the original dry sound. So what does it sound like with our bendy synth and with our guitar having their ensemble and the flanging effect and this reverb being applied to the reverb on the twang pluck, still being careful, and the warm keys part? Sounds like this. I really like that. And there's one more thing I could do to this phaser. You can see that what I've done is to restrict the kind of sweep between 360 hertz and 2.3 kilohertz. So effectively the kind of sweep of that is now restricted in terms of its frequency content. But if what I really want to do is to kind of filter this sound as well, I can absolutely do that here. I can turn these on and I can apply either a high cut to get rid of high end if I want to make this kind of reverb treatment a little bit more mellow, or if I want to, I can scoop out the bottom end. But effectively what we've done in this episode is to look at three really of the most common doubling effects: chorus, flanger and phaser. And within Logic, this Ensemble plugin allows us to take the concept of chorus even further.